The idea of finding all the information for an article summary might feel a little overwhelming if you don't have much experience working with articles, or if you do have experience and found them to be confusing and/or time-consuming. I hope the process I use to walk you through them helps make it seem a little bit more manageable. The recording explaining why I included the sections I include is the first step in that process. This is the second step. I'll explain where we can usually expect to find the information for each section and share some tips for working with Word and with Acrobat Reader. The last step will be the recordings demonstrating the process of completing the article summary. It's probably not too surprising that the title and abstracts are the two most frequently read parts of the research article. Unfortunately, I don't have a citation to support that, but it makes sense, since they tell the reader a lot about the article. Given that, I include the title, authors, and abstract in my summary, so that when I look at the information later, I have a quick way to remind myself of the context for the rest of the information. This information is always at the top of the first page of the article. Each journal is formatted a little differently, but the abstract is almost always just below the article title and author names. Sometimes the formatting makes the abstract really easy to identify, like the example on the left in this slide where it's labeled with the word abstract and shaded in gray. The word abstract isn't always included though, like in the example on the right. Sometimes it's also formatted like the example on the left, but without the word abstract as a heading. Just keep in mind, you're looking for a summary of the entire study, and it's usually on the first page, between the author information and the first paragraph of the article. It's okay to copy and paste information from the articles into the summary for the most part. Since you know that it's a summary of the study in the article, and you have the title with the abstract first thing, you don't need to add citations. Since part of the purpose is to make it easier to work with the information later, though, it's worth taking an extra minute or two to format the text in a way that'll make it easier to read later. One way to do that without taking too much time is to use a feature called Paste Special in Microsoft Word. This slide shows the differences in the formatting when I use Ctrl-V to paste the text compared to using Paste Special. The version on the left is the regular paste. The version with the Paste Special can still be cleaned up a little, and you'll notice I do some of that in the demonstrations, but it takes less time than if I started with the text the other way. There are a few ways to use Paste Special in Word. One is to right-click with your mouse and look for the Paste options in the lower menu, then select the icon that has the clipboard with the letter A. You can also go to the Home menu and click on the downward arrow under the word Paste, then select the icon with the letter A. Another way is to use Control plus Alt and V, all those keys at the same time. It's a variation on the keyboard shortcut for Paste. That one isn't as efficient for me though, because it brings up a menu where we have to select Unformatted Text. If you're trying to paste special and you don't see the option with the letter A or don't see unformatted text in the options, it might be that things you're trying to paste are as a picture. Copying the text again usually gets me what I need when that happens. I formatted the summary worksheet and the analysis worksheet we'll use in the next module as a table because it seems to be the easiest way to make each part of the information visible. It does make it a little trickier to format the text though, so I wanted to point out something else in Microsoft Word while I'm thinking about it. You'll notice that I used list options to organize information in the demonstrations and examples. The first part of that process is the same as in other Word documents. If you want to indent part of the list, though, you need to use the Indent button in the Home menu or one of the other menu options for formatting. If you use the Tab key to indent like you can in other documents, it'll take you to the next section of the table. The section of the summary labeled Focus of the Article is where we'll include information about the purpose, goal, research questions, and/or hypotheses. Knowing a little bit about APA style and working strategically helps us find that information without having to read all of the article, which makes it less time-consuming and much less overwhelming to figure out the article. The structure of the introduction section of an APA style manuscript is usually a bit like a funnel. It starts with a broad idea and gets more focused as it goes along. Knowing that helps us know what we should be able to learn about the author's goals, purpose, and research questions early in the introduction section because they're more general statements about the study. The hypotheses are the specific predictions, so they'll be later in the introduction section. It's not unusual for them to be the very last paragraph in that section. APA style also encourages authors to summarize the findings of the study at the beginning of the discussion section. So the first paragraphs of that section often restate the hypothesis or research question. When we skim those paragraphs in the intro and discussion sections, we can look for the keywords that signal what the authors are interested in. Aside from the obvious keywords, like purpose and hypothesis, you can look for related words like I have in this slide. Sometimes hypotheses are also formatted differently, so make sure to look for visual cues as well. As you're looking for the information, make sure to skim or read the entire paragraph. And if the section doesn't end, look at the next paragraph too. Studies are frequently based on more than one question or hypotheses. The information about the focus of the article sometimes can hide, so using Control+F can be a helpful strategy to make sure you don't overlook anything. It's still important to read the sentences though, because sometimes the words are used in different contexts that don't relate to what we're looking for. When I demonstrate the process of creating summaries, I'll mention more about that. The next section is labeled Recruitment, and that includes the information about how participants are recruited for a study, which is typically included in the participant subsection of the method section. Sometimes, though, the authors include it as they explain the procedure. So if we don't find the details we would expect in the participant section, it's good to check the procedure. The most obvious keywords to watch for are the ones that are variations on the word recruitment. Many studies use samples of students, so looking for the word credit can be a helpful strategy too. Similarly, it's not uncommon for researchers to offer an opportunity to enter a prize drawing, so looking for a word like drawing can be helpful. Sometimes researchers also directly identify the sampling method, so looking for words like random or convenience can help you find the related section of the article. Just make sure you're thinking about random selection of participants and not random assignment to conditions if you use the word random. If you're thinking that the details about the sample should be in the participant section, that is correct. Sometimes the authors of the journal do interesting things though, and put most of the details in a table in the results section. When the information is in a table, it's a little easier to spot than if it's in the text, but we still need to remember it might be hiding there. If it doesn't pretty much just jump out at you in the text, you can use Control+F to look for keywords related to demographics, like female, and that usually takes you to the part of the article with all of the information about the sample. The mean age, which is the average age, is sometimes labeled with a capital letter M and the equal sign. So if you see that, you know the number that follows is the mean. I also included a section in the summary for other relevant characteristics. It's not unusual for an article to include information about the participants that isn't a study variable, but could be related to the results, particularly in non-experimental studies when the design didn't control for extraneous variables. When the article includes information about other relevant characteristics, it's usually in the same paragraphs or table with the more traditional demographic information, like age range and ethnic representation of participants. The information about the operational definitions of the variables are typically in the subsections of the method, and I would say the majority of articles include a section labeled Measures or Materials that includes the details about the measured variables. I'm just going to call it the Materials section going forward. It gets a little trickier though with studies that manipulate a variable or do something to make sure all of the participants have the same experience. I'm getting ahead of myself though. One of the easiest ways to start finding the information about the variables is by going back to the focus. If we keep in mind that the variables are what the researchers are interested in, then they can be fairly easy to spot in the questions and hypotheses. The wording of the questions and hypotheses also usually helps us know whether we're looking for information about a measured variable or a manipulated variable. If the authors use words like cause or impact, that signals the independent variable and, therefore, the one that will be manipulated. When you review the focus, it's also helpful to think about whether the authors state or imply when the variables are related. For example, if the questions or hypotheses give the impression the variables are related when people are stressed. In those cases, it's helpful to look for information about how they know whether participants were stressed. Sometimes it'll look like a manipulated variable, and then you realize it isn't actually a variable because all the participants did the same thing. It's important to include information about how they knew participants were stressed, though, because that's part of the operational definition of the variables. After I have a list of variables, I start looking for the operational definitions in the materials subsection. That section typically includes all of the information about the operational definition of each measured variable. If the headings don't make it easy to find, you can search for a word like item or question, because the descriptions usually include the number of items or questions in a self-report measure, and many studies include at least one self-report measure. If the focus suggests that the study included a manipulated variable, the materials subsection might include measures that were used to confirm the manipulation was successful, whether it actually created the intended differences between the groups of participants. It's important to include the information about those measures in the summary, but we also need to make sure to include the information about what the groups actually were. In other words, we need to have information about how the different levels or condition of the independent variable were defined. The information about how the levels or conditions were actually defined tends to be in the procedure. So you might find the measure of how effective it was before you find the information about how they created the differences between the groups. It's important to keep in mind then that you'll probably overlook important information if you only look at the measure subsection of an experimental study. It's usually good practice to skim all of the methods section for experimental studies. But what information are we looking for? That depends on whether the variable is measured or manipulated. And if it's measured, it depends on how it's measured. The heading for the section of the summary worksheet includes the information we hope to find about each type of variable. Notice that I said we hope to find. Sometimes the articles are pretty stingy with the details, so don't worry too much if you've reviewed all of the methods section and haven't found all of the details. One thing that might be helpful to note is that the details we're looking for with the self-report measures include scales included in the measure. That's different than the measurement scales or response scales. That's the term that we use to describe the substance or the subsections of a measure if it generates more than one score. For example, one measure of coping, the cope inventory, includes questions about 15 types of coping. So the questions about each type are called a scale, and there are 15 scales in the measure. You might not have to look at anything in the article to determine the research design after finding the information about the focus and the variables, especially after you get used to looking at the articles. The reason I say that is because those sections include the details that differentiate between the different study designs. If all the variables are measured, then we know it's non-experimental. And if there's a manipulated variable, then we know it's an experiment. If you need to check your understanding, you can search for the word experiment. But make sure, as usual, to read the sentence. Sometimes editors miss things, like the authors referring to experimenters when they describe the procedure for a non-experimental study. You can also use a keyword search to think about the more specific type of design. It might seem a little overwhelming to try to summarize the results of some of these studies, but hopefully the strategies I'm going to share will help with that. It might also help to remember, too, that the goals for this class are to understand scientific literacy, including the components of research designs, and be knowledgeable of research to interpret findings. In other words, our purpose is to understand how science contributes to knowledge. We can accomplish that without getting into the nitty-gritty of the analysis. We just need to know whether the authors found support for the hypotheses, or how the data answered the research questions. Given that, I find it's helpful to start by copying and pasting the research questions and/or hypotheses from the focus section into this section. Then I look for the results related to each one. I wish the APA style included guidelines that the results section should include a clear statement about whether each hypothesis was supported. Some authors use that approach, and it's incredibly helpful. I find the ones that only do that for part of the hypotheses are downright frustrating, but I digress. My point is that sometimes we can compile a good summary of the results by looking for phrases indicating whether each hypothesis was supported, or that the author is explaining how the analysis answered one of the research questions. That said, it's also helpful to keep in mind that most studies summarize the findings at the beginning of the discussion. So sometimes we can find a straightforward summary of the findings and a few paragraphs in that section. It can be easy to start by reading the first couple of paragraphs of the discussion. If that doesn't address all the hypotheses or research questions, or you quickly get the idea the authors alternate between talking about the results of the study and how it relates to other studies, you can switch and look at the first sentence of each paragraph to look for cues related to each hypothesis or research question. If the discussion seems to be missing a summary, check the last paragraph of the results. Sometimes the authors put the summary there. Looking at the last sentence of each paragraph in the results section can also be helpful, because sometimes authors summarize the findings for each analysis at the end of the related paragraph or section.